Hi, I'm Aiden Keener, an archaeology student at Colorado State University in Fort Collins. I'm standing here at the city's own Sugar Beet Park, right next to a statue called the Hand That Feeds. This statue was dedicated 2 years ago in dedication to the sugar beet workers that were once so important to this city and this region's economy. From 1900 to 1960, the sugar beet industry was one of the most important in Fort Collins and all of northern Colorado. Physical constructions like these remind us that these developments in history happened right in our backyard, using physical objects held by real people. We're surrounded by neighborhoods and the remnants of factories that were central to that industry. And in what follows, I would like to take you on a tour of these important physical artifacts that remind us of the people who made them and the societies that those people navigated. The story of the sugar beet industry in Fort Collins begins with the land. All of northern Colorado has abundant sunshine, summer rainfalls, and a well-balanced soil, which makes this the ideal growing climate for sugar beets. Industrialists started recognizing this in the 1890s as sugar factories started to open up in Greeley and Loveland. Seeing this, Fort Collins local leaders in banking and industry pooled their money to create the Great Western Sugar Company, which was chartered in 1901 and began securing capital for a factory that was completed by 1904. From then on, the stage was set for 60 years of sugar beet growing. In the early 1900s, most workers in the Great Western Sugar Company, the beet fields, and the sugar factories that marked their presence here in Fort Collins were Germans from Russia. They were prized for their agricultural skills and therefore were recruited heavily by the company. They came to these neighborhoods in the Tres Colonias area. This is one of the original constructions that marked the area, called the Maniville Sour property, preserved in 2019. This rough construction reminds us of the simple materials used to build properties here in this area so that the workers would have a roof over their heads before they went back to work every day. These neighborhoods served as a way of providing for them, however they also unfortunately isolated them from the rest of Fort Collins. They lacked the municipal services that the rest of the city had, and so to get ahead, they started to leave the sugar industry and these company-provided tracts that they were living on. They integrated into the local economy, meaning there were gaps in the sugar beet industry that had to be filled. As German Russians moved out of the industry, Mexicans recruited by the Great Western Sugar Company moved in. These workers were people like John Romero, who built this adobe house in 1927 here in the neighborhood of Andersonville. Just like Buckingham Place and like the neighborhood of Alta Vista, which would be constructed and developed a few years after this house was built, and one of the last colonies established by the company, these houses were built with readily available materials on company land by the Mexican workers who were employed by the company. Thanks to the preservation efforts of the city in 2001, this house was protected and now remains in its original condition as a museum of the Mexican-American community here in Fort Collins. This is yet another example of how historical preservation is a useful educational tool in reminding us of the everyday lives of people who made history. Workers would walk from the nearby Tres Colonias neighborhoods to this very spot right here. Nowadays, this is the Fort Collins Street Department, but it was once the site of the Great Western Company's sugar factory until its closure in 1960. The brick construction behind me is the only remnant that remains of that factory, but thankfully the city's interest in historical preservation has allowed us to still see some of that plain industrial construction that marked the lives of so many. When workers would arrive here, they'd be part of the assembly line in one of the complex processes required to turn sugar beets into sugar. The sugar beets would first be processed after their arrival via Flume, where they'd be power washed and then finally chopped and boiled at high temperatures to separate off their sugary contents. Once those contents were separated, they would be treated with lime to lower their acidity, and then that lime-treated water would get separated into a syrupy juice, which would be filtered out until it finally left nothing but sugar crystal, which would be processed by the company on their factory grounds and then sent off to the rails right near me to be sold in American markets. This made huge profits for the factory owners and bankers, but for those laboring in the industry, the picture wasn't so rosy. Farmhands would only make about 75 cents a day, with even the most skilled workers making about $1.25 a day. Meanwhile, workers in the factory would be working in dangerous and unpleasant conditions that could sometimes lead to death, and they would only make about $1 a day as well. Once the sugar crystals were separated from the waste material, that wastewater would get dumped right here at the Effluent sugar flume. It was built in 1927 in one of the Great Western Sugar Company's final expansions of infrastructure. Waste products would run right through this flume that you see behind me and go into a field where the waste products would be dumped after traveling from the factory and through that flume down to here. Surrounding me are invasive caccina plants, which thrived in the alkaline poison soil that the waste products created. All of these invasive species, as well as the remnants of the flume, would prove to outlive the sugar company. The Great Depression and World War II brought about dire economic conditions that led factories to rack up debt as demand slowed. The sugar factory here in Fort Collins would close in 1960, leaving nothing but these ruins, which have thankfully been preserved by the Fort Collins municipal government in order to keep teaching us vital lessons about the past. Right nearby me, here on the Cooter Trail that we're at, there's an interpretive sign to help people understand the importance of these physical remnants of the past. The story of the sugar beet industry is ultimately one of the 20th century. There are themes of economic development, labor rights, and immigration. We see some of the major trends of that period in world history, especially the fact that industrial development was beneficial for a small subset of people, the industrial owning class. It was far more beneficial than the workers who labored for substandard wages. Meanwhile, it also came at the cost of environmental health, leading to shifts away from these polluting industries later in the 20th century. Thanks to historical preservation efforts, we were able to see these vital footprints that take us right back to the past and the real lives that were being lived in those times. It is important that physical footprints like the Effluent flume and the houses in the Tres Colonias neighborhood survive so that we can understand the past as a reality and not just a distant story read about in a book.